This is Book Public from Texas Public Radio. I'm Yvette Benavides. In Manuel Muñoz's story collection, The Consequences, we learn about characters and their conflicts in California's Central Valley, in the small towns around Fresno. Most of the stories are set in the 80s. Most of the characters are Mexican or Mexican-American. They are farm workers, those unsung, invisible laborers who do the fine-fingered work that helps put food on our tables. They're also persecuted by the migra and others in their circles as they manage that strange brand of displacement experienced by characters whose identity is not so easily defined or named. They are American-born or from Mexico, young or old, gay or straight. The characters are young mothers and teens, husbands and wives, migrant workers, or the foreman of those workers. All stories are about loss. They say for us the unsayable. The stories stand for the things we cannot articulate. What do these stories by Manuel Muñoz say for us? A lot. About the journeys we take from one country to another, from one town to the next, from one stage of life to whatever inevitably awaits us. With these stories, we see the reality of human nature, of human foibles, but also the ways we work towards small moments of reckoning with our verdades, our truths, as a kind of survival, by simply moving forward, pressing on, persisting. I spoke to author Manuel Muñoz about his story collection, The Consequences. So I do want to start with the idea of the short story to begin with and why you are telling your stories in this form again.
I suppose that there's something that I'm drawn to with the form, how compressed it is, and the challenge it takes to, I don't want to say sum up a life, but it seems that the best stories or the stories that have always affected me are the ones that have seemed to give you the totality of someone's experience in just the well-chosen moment. And that's what I'm drawn to with writing. I keep trying to look for that pinpoint of experience of a character's life that will fit the story and rather than a novel.
And it's so interesting because I think sometimes people have the assumption that you're doing the exact opposite when you write a short story, that you couldn't possibly compress it all in that way. I'm a devotee of the story theories that Charles E. May has written about. He's written a lot about how stories say the unsayable. So I was really struck by an essay that you wrote for LitHub where you say, quote, "I write fiction because I'm often trying to get at the emotional mystery of a glance or an unspoken exchange or a decision made in a moment. Whatever might reside in the unsayable has always seemed most potent to me as a reader when it's confronted by a character who may not know the most satisfying answer." And I printed that out and I put it on my computer so I can look at it all the time. It's so profound. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that idea.
Sometimes I think about how and why, just to go back to the stories at my kitchen table, hearing my parents tell stories, and why they're so good at it. And I think there's something about how they have decided they can read the moment in the room when everyone around them is ready to hear what they're about to say. And I just think that there's something there about their ability to figure out, pull it. It's just like pulling something out of the sky. It's just their knowingness of how and why something seemingly, not very monumental or important in their daily life warrants everybody around them needing to listen to it. And they craft a great story, and usually it's very funny. But other times when it's something profound or moving or extraordinarily sad or redemptive, that talent to recognize that moment that's what always has drawn me to the story. Novels, of course, do that, but there is something about knowing when you have had something monumental in your own life. Grace Paley, enormous changes at the last minute, right?
Yes, and the thing is, you're not doing anything to undercut the story. It's actually, it's in full bloom somehow, exactly as you say. It's a knowingness that can come through in a very economical, tiny space. It's magic. I don't know how else to describe it, but I do want to talk about the stories and the consequences. Most of the characters are Mexican or Mexican American. They are farm workers. Where most of the stories are set, I think, in the 80s. There are no cell phones in your stories. And I was thinking about that, how the characters in these stories are cut off from someone or something or some place. But even a smartphone would not help matters. It wouldn't do nothing to connect them. It was so interesting to me to read through a story like Anyone Can Do It, for example, or The Happiest Girl in the Whole USA, and see how the women in these stories are so clearly bereft of connection, even when they're around others. But I did think about that, like sort of the modern convenience of the cell phone, of of Google Maps or something. There's nothing to connect them, and that was such an interesting thing to me, that there's a timelessness about the stories also.
Well, I've spoken about my mother bringing my father back from the border. My mother is U.S. born. My father is Mexicano. And before the Immigration Act in the mid-'80s, and before he had his status, a lot more stable for our family, she was constantly going down to the border to pick him up when he was deported. And it happened several times, many times when I was a child. It was only later when I kept asking her to tell me a little bit about those experiences that her pride in how all of us maybe underestimated how difficult it was to accomplish something like that when you don't have money, when you don't have credit card, when you don't have any modern inconvenience. And what you're relying on strictly when it comes to the people that you love is the trust and the faith that they'll follow a plan. There's a story in the collection called The Happiest Girl in the Whole USA that was based in part on my mother being very clear with me what the understood plan was between the two of them. The park in LA where she would go to meet him. If he didn't make it back, she went to another park in San Diego, right across the border. And, there's something fatalistic where they said, if he didn't show up to either one of those places, then ya estuvo. He wasn't going to be coming back. But it always worked. And there's something miraculous in that story. There is something, it tells me a lot about faith and as I said, in trust and love too, that you're going to rely on these plans to make sure that you come back together, and it always worked. And of course, I'm sure that there are many, many stories where that didn't work for many people. And there's a certain amount of gratitude that I have in hearing, my parents communicate these stories to me about how they survived, frankly.
That's such an interesting idea that I hadn't considered. You look at a story like The Happiest Girl in the Whole USA, it's the same title as that Donna Fargo song, the kind of like kitschy song about a carefree girl. It's so incongruous, right? And you enter the story and it's just so wonderfully opposite of this idea. Although, is that what our character our first person narrator is looking to be the happiest girl in the whole USA. But yes, this idea about sort of hitching your wagon to the idea of faith. Well, if he's there, he's there. If he's not, oh well. And you're so right. You're so right that it's an act of faith every time. And as you say, it's that way for so many people.
And can I just say that I'm just so glad that you brought up the Donna Fargo song, because when I think about how people describe the domestic or the family story, I think sometimes when they limit what that means, they forget about communities like mine. That we have a different way of thinking about what a family story might be. And that's precisely why I chose that title, because that song seems to, show you this idea of domestic bliss. And I keep thinking, boy, that's not at all how my mom would describe it. And it fit. I said, yeah, why not use it as a title that works against, this idea of, quote unquote, American happiness, and to see that there are many ways in which we can put our families together and showcase our love for one another. Thank you for mentioning that.
Oh, no. And I was thinking about that song and how there's a certain melancholy that I had never conceived before. I had never perceived before in thinking about that song. And maybe just marrying it to the story sort of allowed me to see what was there all along. But there's something about how the character engages with the woman that she meets, Natalia, and the ways that she is sort of that person for her, the person that might restore your sense of faith or your sense of connection. And that also was a very interesting part of the story for me. It wasn't necessarily a paying it forward, but it was sort of just an understanding between the two of them who are sort of on very similar journeys. And Timoteo's there at last, and the story can continue for our main character. But yeah, that story has really stayed with me. That one, and Anyone Can Do It also. I mean, the first line of Anyone Can Do It is, her immediate concern was money. Right out of the gate, first line of the story. What a first line. And this is a story about Delfina. Can you talk a little bit about this story?
Yeah, in some ways it was intended to be a mirror of Happiest Girl, because when I completed Happiest Girl, I kept thinking about those moments when I was in graduate school, or even early in my career, when I recall how some people would think about my work, and use words like dignity or nobility, but not in a complimentary way, we'll say. Because your characters are so downtrodden, you'll never let them do anything terrible. And I've always thought that was a misreading, because I've allowed my characters to do some pretty reprehensible things. So in this case, I just decided, all right, well, let me see if I can come up with a situation in which those things are out the window. When someone is in desperate need and is looking for help and essentially does not get it. The flip side of trust, essentially. It was a difficult story to write. And even now, as I hear people talk about it and the kind of impact that it has, I'm on the one hand a little astounded by the response, but on the other, not surprised. Because again, when we think about the difficulties of surviving lives like ours and conditions like ours, many different things can happen, including betrayal, including wrongdoing, and including things that will eventually invite loss.
The idea in this story, as in the others, as you say, that the characters can do some pretty reprehensible things. I mean, this is it. We're all flawed. We all have conflict. We're all looking for a way through. And to sanitize a story by making these characters peerless and pure and 100% good. That's not realistic. And in these, daily battles to survive, people sometimes are driven to do some desperate things. I think, too, about in this story, how the little boy took the car, the tiny toy car, and, I couldn't help but think about, I don't know, Victor Hugo or something, this idea of how he was so innocent. And it didn't feel like, he really needed that little car. But he really was that innocent. And so it feels like Delfina is carrying the burden of that. It's hard for me to explain it, but I felt like at that point in the story, she's now carrying an extra burden about how her little son perceives the world and these very dire situations that they are in together. I want to ask you also about Presumido. This is another story in the collection. Presumido is one of those words that we can translate sort of like directly and literally, but there's always a little bit more to say beyond the dictionary definition. And in the story, we have the characters of Juan and Daryl. They are a couple, and we come to see their relationship so clearly, thanks in part to another character named Severina. But the idea of presumido, I wonder if you can talk about that and this story a little bit, like the idea of the title and that word with its shades of meaning and, I guess, connotations.
Yeah, I'm very drawn to those words, precisely as you know, because we can't translate them cleanly, or even if we do offer a word, like, for example, maybe the easy presumptuous, it's not the same thing. Arrogant is more is more aligned with that. There's something, and there's also, even in that word, presumido, already there's something built in within the way that we use it that's signaling someone who's leaping out of class. And I knew that was going to be a word I was going to work with somehow. Susto is another one. And I recognize now, in talking about the stories in the past couple of weeks, and people have asked about the use of Spanish, I think both times characters even say, "Do you know what this word is?" as if I'm trying to, make sure that the audience that does know Spanish is going to key in on the dimensions that they know behind those words. Presumido is a story about class. It's about, they're two gay men who are together and they have bought a house. But unspoken, again, that unsayable moment is one of them, Juan, being very uncomfortable with what it signals to him. And he's just not simply able to declare it. I don't want to say necessarily that the story started with the word, but sometimes there are words like that in our vocabulary, that tension between English and Spanish that in some ways almost invites a story. It invites an explanation or some kind of parsing that I think is really valuable. Certainly the poets know it, So, why not? Why shouldn't it come into the realm of the story?
It is so much about these layers that you're talking about. In the story, you write, presumido, the word had weight, like the heat in the kitchen with an added sting, because Severina had to resort to Spanish to describe Daryl, the way he laughed with Bobby, with Fred, the way he wanted everyone to look at him. And then Juan says, "No, I don't speak Spanish very well." And he's lying. He's stretching the truth in that moment. And then there's this whole kind of deliberation on the different shades of meaning of that word. But I wanted to talk, too, about the connection to the father, to Juan's father, coming into the space and craning his neck to see the rooms. I mean, I even found something in that to connect to this idea of maybe the father's willingness to walk in those spaces, be in those spaces, and try to understand, that's then coloring the way that Juan is connecting to basically what is, his future, his new life in this space. And then Severina's there to remind him or to maybe help him see that more closely.
Yeah, I tend to use characters that way, or the secondary characters that way. Sometimes, there isn't a direct interaction between the main character and a side character like that, but there's usually just enough for me to shape how they're able to read their own situation. And in this one, this character is also, I don't want to call him an alcoholic, but we see him drink quite a bit. Mm-hmm. But his alcoholism isn't necessarily, an important juncture in the story. It is his avoidance of conflict, his inability to say what he needs, what he's thinking, but other people and how he sees either people observing him or observing his space. That's what he uses to try to figure something out about his own life. There's also a couple of moments in that story where he's so fixated on watching images on TV in kind of a stupor. To me, it's meant to underscore just how he's desperate to find something that shows him who he is. Yeah, it's sort of a strange story because it was a story that I thought people would maybe not respond to because it was explicitly about class, but of a different kind of class. But when the collection was being shopped around to publishers, I was very surprised by how many people brought it up and how it seemed to give them a dimension of the valley that they hadn't expected.
That's so interesting because I wondered a little bit about, again, the choice of the word in Spanish for the title and how that might put people off or make them assume things about the story. But it's another one of your stories that just takes the breath right out of our bodies. And the character of the father really did that for me. Because I can see Juan's avoidance. I can see, not to be too with Chekhov's gun and all that, but I sort of thought, there's more beer. There's somebody's got to drink that beer. And then I kept thinking about how terrible he felt after drinking and how it was obviously a little bit of a source of tension between him and Daryl. And even, Severina notices it too. So yeah, this avoidance of what is in front of him to be able to hold on to and accept as, who he is. But it is very hard. And there's other tensions in the story, of course, with the other people at all these dinner parties. I want to ask you finally about the consequences. This is the title story in the collection. It's very much about the idea of living, of moving through life with consequences, with the burden maybe of the consequences of our actions obviously that occur at an earlier point in our lives, and then that just come home to roost, and there's a reckoning that has to happen. It was such a profound story, and so profound to me to think about again and again with these stories, how our choices affect us days, weeks, months, and years on.
Well, to go back full circle, this is one of those stories that seem to have the underpinnings of a novel. It's a big story. We need to know a little bit more about Mark and also about Teddy. Can you go back in time? Can you give us more about how they first met, so on and so forth? It's a story of a relationship that doesn't last very long. And Mark is in California. Teddy is from Texas, and we'll later find out that he's been traveling from place to place, but he winds up with Mark. But because he gets ill, and it's not stated, but it's understood to be HIV in the 80s, he's got no place else to go. Mark is not willing to take care of him and sends him home. He goes back to Texas. that story, just when I tell it like that, even to myself, I think, wow, that should have been a novel. But I realized as I was shaping it that I could narrow it down to precisely those moments you were talking about, to hone in on the idea of guilt. What does it feel like to make a decision that is so momentous like that, and then instantly regret it? And then I won't give away the ending, but Mark tries to do something to alleviate that sense of regret and guilt that he has, and I think it's for naught. But readers might read the ending differently. But yeah, I mean that's one of them where I am really appreciative of the potential for the scope of a big story, but that also sends us a signal that many of the characters we find in any stories, I don't mean just mine, but in short stories, they're indicative of a rich, deep life. And this is just the snapshot that the writer has chosen to give to you.
Manuel Muñoz, thank you so much. What a thrill to get to talk to you. Thank you.
This was absolutely my pleasure. Gracias.
Manuel Muñoz is the author of the story collection, The Consequences. This has been Book Public from Texas Public Radio. Write to us at bookpublic@tpr.org. Jacob Rosati composed our theme music. Dan Katz is Texas Public Radio's news director. We had help this week from David Martin Davies. I'm Yvette Benavides.